Hello, everybody. So we are going to be talking about chapter one today. So hopefully you guys have had a chance to look at the video regarding the course introduction slash syllabus. So that's posted in a few different places for you. That's posted on the YouTube channel on on the module one video discussions and more, whatever it's titled. It's also posted underneath the link for the syllabus quiz. So it's in several places. And I also sent you the link for the video in an email. And hopefully you have seen, even if you haven't had a chance to watch it, hopefully you've seen that information as well as the information for the primary election project. So both of those recordings are up and they're in multiple places, and I emailed everything to you guys as well. So if you have any questions or you have any problems or whatever, you should be able to view those on YouTube. Canvas is very limited when it comes to like memory space, so you can only like upload like actual videos for so much. So you either have to do the link through Zoom for like, and then you've got to be like logged into Canvas and all of that for that to work. I believe I might actually not be correct about that. So I find that it's helpful to have all of the videos in one spot. So that's why I have it like all in like a YouTube channel. So there's like a playlist of lectures for the class. There's a sorry. Sorry about that. My husband had to grab a pet who had snuck in earlier. So oh, so on the YouTube channel there is a playlist for all of the lectures. There's a playlist for each chapter where I've found supplemental videos that I find are helpful for people who need additional information if they're still having trouble getting their head around a topic. It's not mandated for you to watch those, but they're there if you feel like you need additional information. So I have all of that in two different YouTube sections because they'll only let you do so many like playlists in a section. So I have it broken up into two sections for the course. So hopefully you find that helpful. Let me know if you have any problems or if you can't find the link or whatever, but I've got it in several different places. So wherever you like click, you should be able to find it. So, okay, so we're going to get started on chapter one, which is introduction, the citizen and government. So I've got my screen share here for the chapter one PowerPoint slide. So I want to get that started. So it doesn't look, there we go. That looks better, I think. Okay. All right, let me get this shared. Okay. So, all right, let me make sure I've got, there we go. Okay. So, um, so we're going to get started. So if you want to like follow along in the book, or if you just want to like watch the screen, you know, like whatever works best for you, obviously is perfectly fine. So at the very beginning of your book, you'll see these images on page 3. So it talks about how during the pandemic, which we are all super familiar with now, the Strategic National Stockpile was deployed to help get healthcare workers protective equipment. Unfortunately, there was a shortage, as we're all aware of. Some states got more equipment than others, depending on population and need of the state. Here you see Florida nurses with masks and face shields as they start testing at a senior center. We're still actually dealing with shortages as a result of COVID. You know, we've had all of these needs for vials and needles and things like that, like for the vaccines and stuff. Um, and there's still like a nationwide shortage, which is crazy. I'm diabetic and I'm allergic to the main medication that they would give. So I have to take insulin. And for a little bit there, it was actually very difficult to like get the needles that I needed to like draw into a syringe from a vial because there's such a shortage. And so a lot of people, you know, have to do that for various reasons, you know, not to mention doctors' offices. So, and then you run the risk of people choosing to use needles multiple times to try and make them last longer, which isn't good because they get dull and, you know, it's a hot mess. So, and a lot of people are still dealing with those sort of shortages. I actually just had a scan done at Open MRI, and they were saying that they're having a ton of problems getting like some of their basic stuff they need. Like, so if there's a scan that requires like a contrast dye, like if they don't have it, then they can't do it. And they've got like, they're at mercy for stuff to be coming in. And that's not just specifically to COVID so much as, you know, there are job shortages right now where like people aren't able to find enough folks. There's problems with deliveries getting to people in a timely manner. There's just a mess of things going on right now that are causing a lot of problems. And when that backs up, everything else backs up, right? So then that causes a lot of problems. So chapter 1 is a lot of really basic information on sort of defining the different sorts of things that you'll hear us talk about throughout the semester. A lot of it is stuff that you're already familiar with, either from history class or just general knowledge, but it's something that we always want to go over to make sure that for those of you who don't, like, you're not missing out, right? So I always recommend to people that when you're going through your chapters to look at your chapter goals that you see here. For chapter 1, it's on page 4. It helps you to sort of have an idea in your head of like what you need to grasp from the chapter. So the first goal talks about differentiate between different forms of government, which we're going to do in just a minute. Describe the rights and responsibilities that citizens actually have themselves in a democracy. Describe the social composition of the American population and how it has changed over time, and we'll be talking about that. Describe how cultural values of liberty, equality, and democracy influence the system of government, and then summarize Americans' attitudes towards government. So we'll be discussing all of this for chapter 1, but it just helps you sort of like mentally break it down by section. If you can kind of go, okay, like I've got a handle on this goal, I've got a handle on this goal, etc. And I'm sure you guys are all familiar, you know, like for studying tips, you know, review the definitions, review any like, you know, little boxes that, you know, oh, here's some critical thinking, you know, like the basics, right? So I shouldn't have to like go over that. I'll probably point them out as we go, just so you can make like a mental note. Some people might want to like take physical notes as if we were in class. Whatever works best for you is fine. So, I mean, you know, your learning style better than I would, and you know what works for you to succeed in the class, and that's all that matters, right? So the first definition is government. Surprise. Right? So government is about institutions and procedures through in which a territory, whatever the territory is, and its people are ruled. So obviously there are a lot of different types of government depending on where you are in the world. And so we'll talk about a few of those, but you know, of course, this is American national government, so we'll be talking mostly about our system. So a lot of people consider like government and politics interchangeable. One doesn't effectively operate without the other, which a lot of people say, oh, get politics out of government. But they really are married in a lot of ways to where one affects the other, and the effectiveness in which it all goes down, really. So and we'll talk about that a lot throughout the semester. So politics refers to the leadership, structure, and policies of governments, and basically how, like, who should be in charge, what direction the government should be going, that sort of thing. That's like the political aspect of it. Like what, you know, what values and stuff do we want to focus on, like as a society, and different political parties focus on different things that they think are important. And so then they're trying to influence the government to head in that direction. which is what the whole thing is about anyways, right? Like that's why we vote. We put people in office who we agree with and what they want to do, right? So that's the political side of government. Um, so a lot of people have always, like people treat government and politics, like those words, like as curse words, right? Like, they say you don't talk politics and you don't talk religion, like with family and at the dinner table and whatever, right? I do the exact opposite because it's what I do for a living. Like I'm always talking about it with people. Um, so a lot of people get a bad taste in their mouth from government. People don't trust it. They always assume the worst of it. And if you have had a chance to watch the course introduction video, you've heard my personal story and how government can go wrong, right? Like, but it can also go right. Like, it all depends on who's in charge, on what's being done. Like nobody's perfect, right? Like we have to remember that the system is built and run by people. People are not perfect, so people make mistakes. Therefore, our government system is not perfect, nor will it ever be, unless it's run by machines, which are what? Created and programmed by people, so still probably not, right? So but people are always sort of suspicious of like everything the government does, whether it's putting up a stop sign or if it's levying taxes. People are always suspicious of the role government has in their lives and in society, and to the level of what they are comfortable giving power to the government. And again, that sort of like depends on your own personal values, right? Like if you're a Republican, you might be more comfortable giving more power to a Republican who has similar values to you. Or if you're a Democrat, same thing with the Democrats, right? So you might be not as trustworthy of somebody that doesn't align with your personal beliefs and values when it comes to politics and government. So it's always like that constant battle, because they're like, we as a society do not all share the exact same belief, right? So government is designed to provide public goods that benefit everyone, but that no individual or specific group of people on its own can afford to supply. So now that varies from time period to time period as to what we've needed, which is why people have always said, and it is deemed that the Constitution is a living, breathing document because it has grown and evolved as society has changed. Founding fathers knew enough to know that they needed to write the document in a way that it wouldn't fall apart, but that it could also grow and change as society grew and changed. They knew that things would not always stay where it was, and they would be foolish to have assumed it were. So that's why there's a certain level of like open to interpretation, but also enough clarity to give our government officials and our judicial system like stepping stones to start off on what the intent was, and how to apply that to like modern day society. So examples of things that our government provides because we don't have the means to do it ourselves: um, military, right? Defense against foreign aggression, maintaining public order. That's where our police force and things like that come into play. Your property rights and measures of economic security. So, you as an individual, way back in the day, people would have like a shotgun or a musket or whatever and like, get off my land. And that would be how they would, protect their property rights. But it's a little more complicated now, right? Like we're very crowded there. That's why we have like property lines. That's why we have like code enforcement and in areas. And then that's why the government regulates and deals with like our economic situation, because we as individuals don't have that power. Like I can't go to like France and say, I'd like to negotiate. Can we do a little barter system, right? Like that's way above my pay grade, right? So that's just some of the things that the government provides, and we'll see how that has changed over time as we go along with the semester. So I really, really love this table, which you'll find on page 6. For those of you who like want to kind of like go along with it, let me slide the little video here out of the way. Let me zoom in some for those of you who, well, is there a way to, I know there's a way to zoom in if I can find, there we go, zoom in, it's right there, hello. Okay, so I need to move this back. So this is an example of a life, like a day in the life of a student at a university, yourself, for example, right? So this is to show you how government touches points of your life in ways that you don't even realize it does. Because a lot of people say, well, government doesn't impact my life. Like I don't really like have much, like the national government doesn't really affect me on a regular basis, but that's not true. So for example, time in general is set by the national government. Like it's an agreed upon, here are your time zones, here's when things start, here's when things end. Like that was established. Like time is relative, right? So showering, your water, unless you're like out in the middle of nowhere, like on a well or something, if you've got city water, that's provided by your local government. So or a private company of some kind. So like that's all regulated, right? And made sure that the water is like clean and filtered and that kind of thing. Have a bowl of cereal, right? Like all the nutrition facts that are like on your box of cereal, that's all by the federal requirements that are set in place of the fact that you have to know what's in your food. Like that's a federal requirement. Like we need to tell people what is in their food so they know what their nutritional value is or isn't. Like I just found out the other day, I'm 38 years old and I just heard this from somebody and I had no idea. Corn has no nutritional value. What? Like what? Like you grow up being told, eat your vegetables. And of course, like corn is like a lot of times like one of those options, but it's like a filler food. What? Had no idea. Also, being that I'm diabetic, like corn is really not a good option because it's a lot of simple carb sugar. So it like spikes. So if you know of anybody who's diabetic, like they should limit their corn intake. And apparently we shouldn't be bothering with corn too much anyway. So but things like that, like those are things that like people didn't used to know that are now. Oh, I'm so sorry. I apologize. Sorry about that. Driving somewhere, taking public transportation, roads are maintained by government. Your seatbelts, your airbags, that's all federal and state laws because cars didn't used to have seatbelts. Cars didn't used to have airbags. Like they were death traps, basically. I mean, they still are, I guess, to a certain extent, but they're much safer now than they used to be. Speed limits, that's all regulated by the government to one, and we'll talk about this in future chapters, but one, to help with gas, like fuel doling out across the country, and to like obviously safety, right? Like if one person's driving 200 and somebody's driving 50, like things could go wrong really fast. So arriving on campus for a public university, buildings are 70% financed by state taxpayers, not to mention that public universities are governed like in a way that private universities are not. Your class tuition is partially paid for, say, with a federal loan, right? If you're not cutting a check, if you've got a loan or you've got financial aid of some kind, you've got grants, like all of those things are through taxpayer dollars, tax deductions. It's all federally regulated. You eat lunch at the cafeteria. That's all done through the Department of Agriculture. American government, I'm your gal. You're taking this because it's required, right? Like either this class or American history, you're required to take one or the other. So state legislator says, hey, this is important. You need to be a well-informed citizen. So third class, say it's computer science, computer, software, internet, all stuff that comes in through the government. Say you have dinner and you're eating hamburger and fries, the meat's been expected by federal agencies. Minimum wage, if you have a job, that's set by federal, state, or local government, which a lot of people don't realize. Like, we used to not have a minimum wage. We also didn't used to have 40-hour work weeks and paid leave time and, you know, all of that stuff. And that was all negotiated through unions. I apologize. I'm so sorry. I don't mean to keep yawning. It's been a long day before I could even get started on this video. I'm sorry. So it'll probably happen again. So I apologize for that. Say you have a FAFSA loan, like that's the Department of Education, like that's all through our federal government. TV, it's regulated by federal government as well, like in public access channels and that sort of thing. Your trash, that's collected by the city, right? So that's all something that's done. So those are all like government regulated items. So a lot of people don't realize that, you know, like your electricity, you know, like all of those things are put into place by the government, whether it be federal, state, or local. So so those are important things to sort of like keep in mind, especially if you hear that. Like, I've been told by people, government doesn't do anything for me. I'm like, really? So did you take a shower today? Did you brush your teeth? Did you grow all your own food, or do you have stuff like in your pantry that's from the grocery store? You know, so like all of that stuff is something that the government deals with on the daily. It's not the pretty glamorous stuff. It's not the stuff that you're going to hear about very often unless there's an issue, you know, like on the news, but it's the day-to-day, you know, neurosy things that have to happen. So trying to move this to where it's not blocking anything. So there are different types of governments, like I mentioned before. Of course, they vary on size and structure, depending on who's governing, depending on the country and what they have set up. So the first definition is actually one page back on page 5, and that's autocracy, which is a single non-elected individual, like a king, a queen, or a dictator. Whether it be in an official stance or unofficial, you know, I'm sure you guys have heard on the news lately, a lot of people are referencing Putin as a dictator and the actions he is currently taking against Ukraine. He sees himself as a hero, but the rest of the world not so much on board with that. He's certainly acting in a dictatorial manner presently. And you know, like England has a queen, of course, and she does impact the government in certain manners, you know, like they ask her opinion on things, they keep her informed on what they're wanting to do. She does have a certain level of pull, but there is also like a true like government in place as well. It's not solely an autocracy. It's not like the queen calls all of the shots. If you've ever watched The Crown, you know, some of it's dramatized, but it gives you kind of like a general idea of what what that relationship is and how that varies based on who the prime minister is and the rapport that's built between the queen and parliament and the prime minister. So the next one is an oligarchy, which I always have trouble pronouncing. I'm actually surprised my tongue cooperated. So your book says it's a form of government in which a small group, such as landowners, military officers, or wealthy merchants, control most of the governing decisions. So they're not really like accountable to the citizens. It's like basically the people who run the show. So it's not like our system where, like we can kick people in and out of office, we vote, like it's a group, it's a team effort, right? It's not quite that way. So it's not a single person like in an autocracy, but it isn't a democracy like our system is. So a democracy is a system of rule that permits citizens to play a significant part in the governmental process. So that's us. Elections are held by, to elect key public officials. So we are considered to be a democracy based on the fact that we do that. We are also considered to be a constitutional government. So these are like types of government. These are definitions of like how the governing is done in those types, right? So we are a constitutional government where we are limited by law and the powers that the government has and how they can exercise them, and then what they don't have the authority to do. And those are the things that the Constitution lays out, which we will be talking about in detail as the semester goes on. There's also the authoritarian government option, which doesn't recognize any limits on its authority, but might be constrained by other institutions, like maybe a business or a church, like maybe they're fronting the money, maybe they're really pulling the the purse strings or whatever. There's also a totalitarian government, which also recognizes no limits and seeks to eliminate other institutions that might challenge it. Sound familiar, right? That's been in the news for a couple months now. So that's certainly what we're seeing with Russia presently. He also controls like the media that his citizens see. Like a lot of people in Russia have no idea that they're being told lies because they're locked in and have no idea what's happening, which is really sad if you think about it. They don't know. I mean, like the soldiers have been told all kinds of different things, like whether it's, oh, this is just like a peacekeeping mission. Some people were told that like, yeah, we're going in guns blazing. Like there are like 3 or 4 different stories I've heard on the news where like the military isn't even like on the same page within its own ranks, which is a problem, right? So definitely like not positive. The Nazi regime is also another group that follow the totalitarian government scheme. Your book talks about how the Soviet Union with Joseph Stalin, Nazi Germany, and currently North Korea. Of course, this book was published before what we're seeing with Russia. Governments not only lack legal limits, but also try to eliminate anybody that challenges their authority. These governments try to control all of a nation's political, economic, and social life. So not good. It's not good. Not even remotely good. A lot of like Latin America, Asia, and Africa see the authoritarian government situation. So this fine gentleman here is a man named John Locke. He is one of like the first folks when we were just like babies starting out before we were in really a government. He was kind of a like big picture sort of thinker. He's considered to be one of the people who influenced our founding fathers, and he's considered to be an English thinker. He lived from 1632 to 1704, and he argued that governments need the consent of the people before they can do stuff. And so he's one of like the big cheese of something that the founders kept falling back to. Like, we need to make sure there's a checks and balances. We need to make sure we don't have a king sort of situation that we just left Britain for. Like, we don't want that again, right? So so that was something that they kept referencing as they were forming our government, to make sure that there's checks and balances and that the people have a say in what happens, so that way they're not being dictated to. So John Locke helps a lot with that. you will see his name again. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Make a note. I don't remember if it's on the exam or the quiz or both, but you will see that again. So make sure that you remember this gentleman's name, and that he's all about making sure that the people are giving consent to the government before the government does stuff. So couple of different things that were really important as they were forming our government. They wanted to make sure that the government was limited. They didn't want it to be so large that it was unstoppable, which some people argue that we have that problem now. Some people don't feel that way. We'll talk about that as we move on too. So because things were so micromanaged and controlled by the king, the founding fathers wanted to make sure that that didn't happen again, and that there were limits where the government encourages levels of freedom so that the people felt like they had a say and weren't oppressed from being able to speak their truth, basically. So and we'll get into this in more detail during the civil liberties and civil rights section, but some of the freedoms they focused on, which you guys are, you know, pretty familiar with: freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, which is like peaceful protest, and conscience, like, you know, you're free to think what you want, basically, as well as freedom from arbitrary search and seizure, and, you know, like where people can't just take your land without justification and without compensation. The founders were not really especially democratic by nature because they were white, they owned property, they, if they weren't educated, they were at least like in positions of like distinction in society. Um, so they weren't like, yeah, we're for everybody, men, women, children, black, white, purple, orange, like it doesn't matter, like everybody's good. Like they were not like that. Because they were old white men. And so there were still a lot of limits, such as you had to be a white male and you had to own property to be able to vote. That's jacked up, right? Like not everybody's got money to own property. And like, if only white men are making the decisions, they're going to be doing it to benefit other white men, right? Like they're not going to be voting to protect women and specifically like women's needs and representation, or African Americans, or, you know, Native Americans, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And we will see why that is obviously problematic time and time again as we talk about the course, from voting rights to land owning to seeing people as a whole person instead of 3/5, right? Stuff you guys are familiar with on some level from history class. So one of the big continual things that you'll see in America's story in our personal timeline is the expansion of the authority um, to more and more people as time has progressed, right? Like we steadily go, ooh, yeah, that's not fair. And that one's not fair. And that's not right. And that's not right. And that's not right. And that's in contradiction with what the Constitution says here, and what the Constitution says here. And we realize that we didn't make it inclusive enough in the beginning because it was just a bunch of white guys at the table, right? So people weren't all represented. And so we'll be talking about that progression throughout the class. So politics, like I mentioned before, is an integral part of government, whether people want to hear that or not, it's true. Politics is the struggle of who gets what, when, and how. Like who gets what power, who gets what benefits, who gets whatever it is that the topic is about, When do they get that? How do they get that? How much do they get that? For how long do they get that? We'll talk about that a lot over the semester. So it's about who is running the show, right? Who's the government leadership, how the government is organized, and what the policies are about whatever the issue is. Obviously, it involves power because whoever's in charge has the power, right? So your book has political power defined as the influence over a government's leadership, organization, and policies. So that's why you hear about it nonstop all the time. If you watch the news at all, if you hear anybody complaining, it's always us versus them, Democrat versus Republican, who can get in power so they can make the largest influence and make the inroads that they want for their own political parties progression that they are wanting, whatever their agenda is, right? So, and that does not stop. People don't understand why, not just because of the current January 6th committee hearings, but why we still hear about the presidency all the time, because that is an office that gets 90 days to get a ton of stuff done. And then the rest of the first year, trying to get the stuff done that they laid out in the first 90 days. And then they're off to the races to run for office again, on top of still trying to do their job, which sounds insane, but it's true because it's a 4-year position. People start filing 2, sometimes 2.5 years out. So you can actually look up, like say in our state with the Division of Elections, and they've already got 2024 race up, and there's probably, I haven't looked at it, so this is an assumption, but I would not be surprised if there were already names on the ballot for 2024. It's usually some small person who isn't going to get anywhere, that you might see like on the state, like who's that? I've never heard of that name before, right? But you might see the likes of a Rick Scott or Ron DeSantis or someone like that, like on the ballot, because of their like long-term political aspirations. So, and most politically elected positions, they're constantly having to like worry about keeping their job while also still trying to actually do their job. So it's a constant back and forth of, like doing what they're supposed to do for their citizens, doing so in a way that the citizens are going to want to reelect them. And then if they have higher political aspirations, growing their support so they can move up the chain. So it's like a constant, they're like constantly applying for a job, basically. The US Senate isn't as bad as literally every other position because they're every 6 years. So there's a little more like gap time, I guess you could say, in that, where they're not maybe constantly running for office, but they do have to keep that like kind of in the back of their mind, right? So so political power obviously shapes a lot of things and is incredibly important. So politics is shaped by the system of government that's in place, like our constitutional democracy, and its opportunities people have to participate, especially in democratic governments. So this always confuses people. Are we a democracy or a republic? Well, we're both. They're different definitions, okay? So if you go back, you look at the definition of democracy: a system of rule that permits citizens to play a significant part in the political process, usually through the election of key public officials, right? So that's the first part of our government, is the democracy aspect. So, and then we talk about the constitutional government, and then we go to the definition of representative democracy, also known as a republic: a system of government in which the populace selects representatives who play a significant role in governmental decision making. So it's like the second part of the fact that we're a democracy, like we play a key role. How do we do that? By being a republic, by electing people. Okay, so does that make sense? Because a lot of people get that confused. I got that confused before I knew as much about government, because it was like, I don't understand. Are we a republic or are we a democracy? Because people associate democracy and republic with Democrat and Republican. Yes, the words are similar by design, but totally separate things. And then we also have a direct democracy. Anybody confused yet? So a direct democracy is a system that permits citizens to vote directly on laws and policies, which we have that get put on our ballot. And they're called initiatives or referendums. And we actually do get those. Now, not every little thing gets put forward to the people, but if like there's a big change on a tax, property tax, school tax, whatever, that is usually put on a ballot. And unfortunately, they don't get a lot of people voting on them because people don't do their homework. They're not informed before they go to the polls. They don't pay attention to what's going to be on the ballot. They fill out the people that they know, and then they get to the amendments or the referendums or whatever, and they're like, oh my God, because the wording is usually yay long. And people are like, I don't know, shoot, like I'm just gonna leave this blank for the people who like have actually done their homework. So a lot of people don't bother to do it. Studies also show that the further down the ticket something is to be voted on, the less likely it is to have as many votes, because people are lazy. Like that's kind of what it boils down to. You know, like presidency or whatever might be at the top, and then, you know, US Senate or, you know, whatever. And so like the higher stuff people are generally looking for, stuff they hear on the news all the time. But when you start getting into the weeds about like mosquito control or school board and that kind of thing, unless it like directly impacts them, most people tend to go meh, like, I don't care about that. So um so unfortunately, like people don't fill out the ballots in their entirety most of the time. Not always. I mean, it depends on the person, but that's more likely to happen for like the average person who's not kind of doing their due diligence before they step into the voting booth. So that's direct democracy. So that whole section is the first chapter goal: differentiate between forms of government. So we have checked that off. So now we're going to describe the rights and responsibilities that citizens have in a democracy. So we are on the second chapter goal now. So this section discusses the participation, knowledge, and the efficacy, therefore, of people's level of knowledge for their participation. So a pattern of struggle among interests in politics is called group politics or pluralism. It's a theory that all interests are and should be free to compete for tongue-tied. Free to compete for influence in government. So, which is, you know, I mean, anything that you can think of, environmental causes, healthcare causes, farming regulations, like whatever, like literally any sort of interest, all should have the option to be able to compete for influence in government. And that's where we get things like, the word just went right out of my head. That's where we get things like lobbyists, and we'll talk about that in more detail later, but and interest groups, which we'll also be discussing in more detail later. So and of course this has to result in a lot of compromise and moderation, because most of the time people aren't going to get 100% of what they are needing from the government. Funds aren't there, or, you know, there's got to be a little robbing Peter to pay Paul sort of situation. Oh my, I'm so sorry, guys. So that's what ends up happening when people are partaking in pluralism. So the next thing that your book defines is citizenship, which a lot of people just think about as, yeah, I'm a I'm either a born US citizen or I'm a naturalized US citizen where I like went through the process to become a US citizen. And yes, that is citizenship. But for purposes of this chapter and this particular topic, it's talking about your personal duty as a member of society and as a US citizen, and your duties to partake in society. Okay, so it's not like yes, I'm a US citizen, or no, I'm not a US citizen. Like it's different. So citizenship is informed and active participation in a political community based on your political knowledge and participation. So this is enlightened political engagement that was actually originated in ancient Greece. So that's where it started from, was in Greece. The idea of being enlightened, being educated on political topics that affect society and that affect the governing source, so that way you can be an informed citizen to make good choices when it comes to voting. So it's not, a lot of people just go into the polls and vote. They just blindly vote. They don't do their homework or their due diligence ahead of time, and they don't research what's on the ballot, and they just, oh, I've seen a lot of yard signs for that person, so more people are probably supporting them, so I guess they're the best. You'd be amazed at how many people just vote the name that sticks out as somebody they're more familiar with, which is lazy. I mean, there's no other way around it, right? That's, I mean, that's just laziness. Because some people feel like, oh, well, I've done my duty if I've voted. But if you aren't informed when you go into the polls, are you really doing your duty? It's the same concept as Christmas treeing a test in school, right? Like, it's not enough that you took the test, like you needed to have studied for the test to do well on it. And the same concept applies for voting. I actually have a family friend who, bless her heart, when she was first starting to get involved in voting, she said that she just would ask her mom how her mom was voting, and then she would vote the exact same way. And I just looked at her like she had green splotches all over her face. And I was like, I'm sorry, you what? And she said, well, you know, I love my mom and I trust her, and she's a really good judge of character and stuff. And like, I feel like she probably does her homework. And I just don't have the time to do all of that. And so I just vote the way she does. I said, oh, so your mom got to vote twice? And she's like, no, I voted. I was like, but did you? Because how do you know if you agree with her if you haven't done the research yourself? Like, you can love somebody to pieces, and then when they start talking politics, you're like, whoa, this person has two heads, right? Like they've just grown like a whole separate head right in front of you. Like, and you don't know how you feel about a subject matter until you do your homework on it. You don't know how you feel about a candidate unless you know what they're running for. But it's not just enough to know what they're running for. You have to know what you stand for and how you feel about issues to know if that candidate lines up with your values. And if you haven't done your homework on that, there's absolutely no way for you to know. So once I explained all of that to her, she was like, oh man, now I feel like crap. I'm like, I'm not trying to make you feel like crap. I just want you to be more engaged. You know, you might not agree with her in the way that you think you will. Now, if you've done all your homework, you guys still agree, great. But now you've gone in with your own opinions, not just hers, because you want to feel like you're doing the right thing, because you're not. You're better off staying home and letting the people who did their homework take the test. So so that's something to keep in mind. That's what your book is referring to when it talks about your duties as a citizen, for citizenship, and for what political knowledge is. So your book defines political knowledge as information about the formal institutions of government, political actors, which are people who are involved in the process, elected officials, lobbyists, staff members, whatever, and political issues. So that that's what they mean by political knowledge. Exactly what it sounds like, right? Like being informed about the inner workings of the system so you can make informed decisions when things come your way. We as citizens need the knowledge to be able to assess our own interests and to know what matters to us and how to act on them when it's presented to us. Like if you see a candidate, you know, like, oh, I think I like this person, or oh, I went to school with this guy, like he's cool. And then he opens his mouth and it's like, whoa, we do not agree on any policy matters at all. Then you wouldn't want to vote for them, right? Like you would want to vote for somebody that lines up with your viewpoints a little better. So that's why it's so important to have that political knowledge to be an informed voter when you know, move forward to make that change and to vote, right? So that's the whole point in the citizenship and political knowledge section. So this image is on page 10 in your book if you're following along. It says protesters are a form of direct action citizens can take to influence policy outcomes. Many citizens, including students and children, have used peaceful protests, keyword being peaceful, and marches to convey concerns about global climate change and demand government action. That's just like one example of, you know, 1,000 different ways that people protest, right? So, and it's protected by our Constitution. It's part of our First Amendment right, the ability to peacefully assemble. So a lot of people don't realize that. They think like anytime there's a protest or anytime there's some kind of demonstration, like those people should be locked up. But as long as they're not defacing government property, they're not beating people down, they're not doing, you know, like damaging private property, as long as they're not violent, they are allowed to do that. They're allowed to protest by law, by our Constitution. And we'll talk about that more when we get into the civil liberties and civil rights section. So the next definition that your book talks about is political efficacy, which is the belief that one can influence government and politics. So that all goes hand in hand with the type of system we have set up, right? A democracy, a republic, direct democracy, constitutional government, being an informed citizen and having the political knowledge. If you take the time to be engaged and to gain political knowledge, then you can be more confident in political efficacy because you will know what you need to do to make substantial change. And it's not just voting. We'll talk about that too, but voting is like the first. Registering to vote and then actually voting are your first lines of activism to be involved, to make sure that you are having political efficacy. So unfortunately, as a general rule, our society has less and less faith in political efficacy. In 1960, 25% of respondents for a poll said that elected officials didn't care what citizens like themselves thought about anything, issues or whatever. In 2019, 71% answered the same way, which is sad because when people feel like that, they feel like there's no point in going to the polls because they feel like their vote doesn't matter. It's bad for democracy because the relationship between the efficacy of voters and participation, it works in both directions, right? If people don't have faith in the system, they're not going to waste their time participating because it's like, well, it doesn't matter. And I know a lot of people who are like that, regardless of what I personally do for a living, how much I politely harass my family, friends, strangers who work at Walmart. Like I had a 30-minute conversation with an employee one time. I asked her where a toy was for my kid, and I don't even know how we got on the topic. Somehow we got on the topic of voting. And I basically convinced her in the aisle to go on her next day off, which was like the next day, and register to vote. And I told her where to go to do it because she had never bothered before, and she made the excuse she didn't have time. She worked, she had kids, whatever. And then I was explaining to her why it's so important to make the time. Like you make time for the things that are important, and that has to be important, and everybody has to feel that way, or this sort of stat becomes true, right? If people aren't showing up, less people are voting. So less people are having a say in what happens in our government. So a smaller percentage of people are in effect ruling or making voting decisions that affect how our government rules and does its job, right? So then again, that'll be like a cycle. So then more people are like, well, like this doesn't represent a lot of the people. Well, because a lot of people didn't show up to vote. So it's a cycle, right? Like it's not going to represent the majority of people unless the majority of people go to vote. So yes, people are people. You elect people on their platforms. You hope that they're honest enough to follow through with them to the best of their ability. And there are a lot of nuances once people get in office that they might not be aware of, that it's not as easy as just saying, you know, here's my magic wand, poof, this is done. It definitely takes more than that, but you know, there's a difference in like that and then the honest, you know, politician or whatever saying, hey, this is more difficult to achieve than I thought. Here's what I'm working on. Here's how I need your help as citizens to make this happen, right? As opposed to the not honest politician who just goes and does whatever they want and lines their buddies' pockets and whatever. And when that kind of thing happens, and say like the news media gets it out there, your neighbors find out about it, whatever, they don't get reelected. They don't get to keep their job, right? Like if you fail at your job, you get fired. It's that simple. All right, well, you lied to me and you weren't qualified for this. You didn't do the job we put you in for. So peace out. Like come re-election, you don't get to stay in office. So those are things that people need to be aware of. Like that's why our process is set up the way it is. Okay, fine, you elected them and it turns out they sucked, so kick them out and get somebody else, as opposed to see the system doesn't work, that individual didn't work, the system again is never going to be perfect because it's people and you're putting a certain level of faith in people. But that is true in any aspect of your life, right? Like you put a certain level of faith in your doctors, in your boss to pay you every week, in your employees to do their job, in your, you know, your family to, you know, I don't know, not stab you in your sleep, like whatever. Like you put a certain level of faith in everybody around you at different levels for different things based on, you know, what's happening, right? Like to, you know, like if you're married, to for you put a certain level of faith into that relationship for the person to not cheat on you or to not be abusive to you and to be a partner, like whatever, right? So everything we do in life requires a certain level of blind faith and trust. And, you know, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, or like fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, right? So, you know, that's life. Like that happens, and it happens in every aspect, and like government is no different. So then you just flip this, you know, the script like the next time, and you just make sure that that person doesn't get to do it again, right? So and I think a lot of people fail to look at government in like a realistic, you know, way. I think people have to remember that, you know, like, you know, we're putting our hope and faith in the general person to not be lying to us, right? And to be able to get in there and do what they need to do. So efficacy is vital. Like it's so important to have faith that you can make a difference, because if you don't feel that way, you're not going to show up to vote. And that kind of negativity spreads like wildfire. It really does. And, you know, maybe your partner doesn't vote because you complain about it enough. And, you know, your kids don't end up voting and your friends don't end up voting. And like your lack of conviction to dig in and do your duty as a citizen can negatively impact others around you. Like you have a duty, a responsibility to be engaged and to be informed and to not just sit idly by and just let things happen to you, right? Like you got to make it happen. You don't just sit there and hope somebody knocks on your door and offers you a job, right? You got to go out and make it happen. It's the same concept. Like you want to see something in your government, you've got to make it happen. And we'll talk about that in other chapters as well, and like other ways that voters can participate in the political process and to help make that change. So, all right, so the next section, who are Americans? Describe the social composition of the American population and how it has changed over time. So we're on page 10 of chapter 1. So, so who we are as a country, right? You know, a lot of people talk about how American identity is like that of a stew, right? Like it's got we got a little bit of everybody. It didn't start out that way. You know, it was all natives at first. A lot of people think that that sounds weird to say natives, but I actually watched a documentary with Native Americans, and a lot of them do not like to be called Native Americans because they're like, this was our land before it was yours, and before you claimed it and named it the Americas, and before you took over, like we're natives to this land regardless. You know, like you know, you don't, you know, you hear Native American, you hear African American, you hear like maybe Hispanic American or Asian American. You don't hear white American, Caucasian American, right? So it's another way to divide us versus them, and we'll be talking about that throughout the semester as well. So so you know, originally it was natives, right? It was Indians, but not really Indians, and that's also offensive to a lot of people. I actually apologize for saying that at all, because Indians are from India, like, you know, so like depending on who you're talking to, like that's offensive to some people. So the original inhabitants of our country, you know, as you're familiar with US history, were discounted, not considered people, slaughtered, decimated, you know, treated like the dirt on the bottom of your shoe. So originally, so the first US Census, and we'll talk about the census in a little more detail later, but you know, the US Census does a head count, right? Like that's the gist of it. Like it does a head count of the people. So the first one was done in 1790, and we counted 3.9 million people. And then in 2020, we were up to 330 million people. That's a big difference, right? So, and a lot of it came from immigration. You know, people have feelings about immigration. And we'll get into a little bit of that, not a lot, because it's a very polarizing subject. But I mean, it basically amounts to the fact that that's how everybody came here. That's not 100% full-blooded Native American, right? Like if you are not from a reservation, you're not 100% Native American, your family immigrated illegally, I might add, because there wasn't an immigration process. Like for a very long time, it was just we came and took over. So regardless of how you feel about immigration, legal or illegal, that's how most everybody got here. It's ridiculous. So anyways, that's my little soapbox on our history anyways. So the first census, however, did not count Native Americans. That's hateful, right? So we had 3.9 million other in 1790 by the time, because you know the first colonists like were coming like into the 1400s, beginning of the 1500s, for the colonies and stuff. And so the first census was not taken for, you know, 200 250 years after that. So there was a lot of time to, you know, make babies and and expand, right, and for more people to come. So but they did not count Native Americans, which is highly offensive, really. I mean, if you think about it. um Originally, a large chunk of our population is of European origin, which is not surprising to people because we, you know, came, saw, conquered, killed a lot of folks, and took over. So, as time has progressed, we've become more and more ethnically diverse. We have gotten a lot of other people coming in, and we'll talk about different time frames when that happened, and how the original European settlers actually tried to stop that for quite a while, to keep us a very white society. Really, there's not another way to put that. So, and we'll talk about that in more detail later. So, um, so immigration has definitely changed, like, you know, how we look as a society, right? So in the 1900s, many immigrants entered the United States through New York's Ellis Island, where they were checked for disease before being admitted. So we basically didn't have a repeat of, you know, smallpox that killed a lot of the natives who were already here. So we at least did learn from that. You know, so as we grew, a lot of anxiety about our ethnic identity started to grow. Could we take in a lot of immigrants? Could we um, assimilate them? Could we blend with them? Could we meld well? Were their political and social values compatible with what we were building as an American democracy? Could they learn to speak English? All those sort of things. Even though that's not what we did, right? Like when we first came over, we didn't try to learn the native language. We didn't try to meld with the natives. We tried to assimilate them and to take over their identity instead of realizing how unbelievably hypocritical that was. So a lot of laws have been passed over the years to limit immigration for various reasons. And we'll talk about some of those examples. Some of them might make sense, some of them didn't, some were out of racial discrimination. There are a lot of different factors. So we'll discuss that as the chapter or as the semester goes on. So this is the image about Ellis Island in your book. So you can see that on page 11. So that was where we had a lot of our immigration coming through during like that like bout of immigration happening. So after World War I, we created a quota system, national origins quota system, where we allowed certain percentages of different types of people from different places to be able to come in, like so much a year, so much at a time, right? Like we'll only allow this number of people each year from this country, and like this from this area, and this from this area. So European countries, specifically Northern European countries, received a larger quota, and that was a way to try and keep us white. White is right is kind of what their attitude was. Like that's the way it needed to be. They wanted to turn back the clock where Northern Europeans dominated culture and dominated society. So by 1970, they had been reduced, that the foreign-born population in the US was at an all-time low of only 5%. So we were trying to, I don't know, resegregate ourselves. We were trying to whitewash is probably a good way to put it. And so that obviously like causes issues overall. So, and if you think about that time frame, that's when you know, we're just coming off of in between World War I and 1970, like we had the civil rights movement and stuff. And obviously there was a lot of efforts to try to stifle minorities in a multitude of ways. And this is just another way to try to do that. So, and your book talks about the different ways that that was done. There were laws about citizenship linked to whiteness. Questions arose about how to classify people of Latino origin. In 1930, for example, the census counted people of Mexican origin as non-white, but a decade later reversed this decision after protests by those affected and by the Mexican government. Only in 1970 did the census officially begin to count people of Hispanic origin, noting that they could be any race. The census used the term Hispanic, but we will generally use the terms Latino and Latina to refer to people of Spanish or Latin American descent, to be able to separate that out. So sorry. Unfortunately, like using racial and ethnic criteria is not a new concept. In 1790, we passed a law stipulating that only whites could be citizens, whether they were US born or naturalized where they immigrated over. And of course, who constitutes as white was, focused mostly on Europe. It wasn't until 1870 that Congress lifted that ban and allowed people who are not white to immigrate. As we started to expand out west, we kind of put the word out where, hey, come help us settle land, help us dig for gold, help us build the railroads to connect the east and the west, and we'll give you some land, and you can immigrate on over. And so we started having a lot of Chinese immigration out through California, and then we took it back. We didn't honor our commitments about land. No surprise there. We also did it to, slaves and that kind of thing. And so in 1882, we created the Chinese Exclusion Act, where we outlawed any Chinese laborers to come into the US after we used them for the bulk of the hard work. It's disappointing, right? Like that feels like a punch in the gut, like just not one of our finer moments. And they were not lifted. Like from 1882 to 1943, we allowed that. Ain't that some ish? That's messed up. So now in the 21st century, we have kind of a different breakdown. You can see on page 13, figure 1.1, immigration by continent of origin. Where did most Americans come from at the start of the 20th century? How does that compare with immigrants in the 21st century? So let me zoom in a little bit in case you need to see that if you're not looking with your book. So you can see here, so the blue, the dark blue is Europe, right, which was the focus. Green is the Americas in general, so like Central America, South America, that could be. The light orange, peach, maybe if you want to call that, is Oceania, red is Africa, and orange is Asia. So as you can see, mostly European, and then that has declined. A lot of Europeans are not coming over now. They're like, y'all be crazy. We have seen an uptick in the Asian immigration after that ban was lifted, right? Not a lot from Oceania. We don't have a lot of folks in general, like in Oceania, right? We've seen a slight uptick in Africa, but we don't have a lot of people coming from there. And then not specified is like, I guess it didn't get tracked. I don't know what the non-specified would qualify as. So less than 1%, like if there's less than 1% of an area, they did not show that in the figure. So obviously largely Europeans, and then other parts of America, Central and South America, and Asia. And that's like that's largely our like makeup. So By 1965, a lot of the immigration restrictions that we had placed had started to be lifted. And that was happening, around the same time as like the civil rights movement, and realizing, ooh, we're treating minorities like dirt. That's a nice word for it, right? So as a result, when that got lifted, we started seeing a lot of immigration happen for people who had not been allowed to come over before, like Asia and Latin America. So as of 2018, we had 60% white, 6% Asian, 13% Black or African American, 18% Latino or Hispanic, two or more races, 3%. Populations who were born outside of the United States, 13.7%. So it's still a very large, like, white population, but that is whittling quickly. We're having a lot of mixed families coming through, which is fantastic. Whatever. And I forget what year the statistics are showing. I think it's by 2060, like whites are not projected to be like the majority. And I say it's high time. Like, we need, like, these other numbers need to come up some. Like, white people have had, run the show for a long time, and we haven't done a very good job of it because we keep screwing people over, right? We keep doing terrible things to people to protect our whiteness. Like the whole skin pigmentation thing makes no sense to me. To hate somebody for their skin tone is the most absurd, asinine thing I've ever heard in my life. Like, it just makes no sense. I'm very much a believer of judge people by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. But unfortunately, that has not been our government stance throughout the majority of our existence. And luckily we're changing that. So in addition to the color of your skin, just, in that regard, there are other things, there are other breakdowns that they look at statistically for the makeup of our country. The next one that your book talks about is religion. So we have a much larger religiously diverse society than we used to have. In 1900, 80% of the population was Protestant. Only 35% are now that way in 2019. 22% are Catholic. 10% consider themselves to be like non-denominational Christian, 2% Jewish, 1% Muslim. And we're at 21% of people who are like, none of the above. I do not associate with a religion. Now, if you ask a lot of people who are of a religious faith, that 21% needs to be prayed for and needs to, they need Jesus or whoever, right? They worry about that growing percentage, but in all reality, it's a fairer representation, because there are a lot of people who participated in religion because you could be just about shunned if you didn't participate in a religion. And those of us who are in the South know how that is. We in the South are definitely, there's a reason why it's called the Bible Belt, right? So, but more and more people are not connecting either with a specific organized religion or any religion at all. A lot of people may consider themselves spiritual, but not connected to religion, or they're more about humanism, putting faith in what they can see. Some people worship trees. There are a multitude of things that people go towards, and we'll talk about some more of that when we get to the civil liberties and religion section. There's a religion that I always like to show my students that people go, what? But it helps to kind of explain separation of church and state. So we're definitely seeing a more diverse society than we did, 122 years ago. So age is the next thing that we look at. So we have a larger, older population, which a lot of that has mostly to do with our medical advancements, right? Like people were not living to be that old before, but now we have healthcare, we have access to like medicines that we didn't used to have, and so people are living longer than their bodies are actually designed for. So in 1900 only 4% of the people were over 65. Today that's 16% and continually growing. Like my mom's 67 and she mentioned the other day, like, well, you know, like so and so just dropped dead and they're like 60 something. I'm like, please stop talking about how you're about to drop dead. But you know, that was a rarity for people to be her age. For those of you who are big like movie fans, like Ray Liotta just passed away and he was 65. And I was just shocked when I saw that because it was like, what? Or like Bob Saget, like anybody who grew up with Full House, like he's a family staple. He was like your TV dad. And just because he like hit his head and like not got knocked out and didn't wake up, like what in the world. um but barring unforeseen health issues or some kind of crazy freak accident like that happening, people are just living longer, and our aging is much slower than a lot of other advanced industrialized countries, and some of that's due to immigration and blending of genetics, really, right? Like because you know some groups of people are healthier for various reasons or have uh like by having blended families, immigrations, not just being white people marrying white people, having white people, it helps breed out some things that might not be great like from one group of people. It helps balance some of that. So that's great. People are living longer. I actually had a doctor tell me recently, and I was shocked by this information. So I made the joke to him that I was falling apart because I have a lot of health ailments. And if you watched the course introduction video, like you understand some of the why. If you haven't watched that, why are you watching chapter 1? Go watch the course introduction video first. So hopefully you guys have all read that if you're watching this video. So I see a rheumatologist because I have an autoimmune disease, and I was joking around about all the things that keep falling apart on me based on the autoimmune disease because it attacks um, everything. And so then you end up having issues that are compiled by the other issue. And I was like, it's just ridiculous. Like, I feel like I'm falling apart. I mean, I know I'm like staring down the barrel of 40, but what in the world? And he said, well, actually, our bodies are not really meant to live longer than the age of 35. And I was like, sorry, what now? And he said, really, like we're not built, like evolutionarily, like we are not built to live past 35, which is why before the advancements of medicine, if you look, like say, you're into ancestry.com or 23andMe or whatever, and you've done like your family tree, which I have and continue to like work on as I have time, you'll see like these women, and men, but more the women, they start having babies young and they basically have babies until they die, or until their reproductive system can't do it anymore. And then a lot of times they pass away like at a younger age, and some of that's probably the amount of babies they were making because it's a lot on somebody's body. But it was because like we didn't have those medical advancements to treat certain issues, right? Like all the ailments that I have, like if we didn't have the medical advancements, I would not have been one of the strong ones, right? If you've ever seen like Zombieland, they say like rule number 1 is like cardio, like only the fittest make it through like the apocalypse, like same with the idea of like Walking Dead or something. I would not like my immune system. If like the world kind of shut down in that regard and you were just left to fend for yourself, I'd be in trouble so fast because I like I have so many issues. Like if I couldn't get to a pharmacy or a doctor, like I'd be one of the first people to be eaten. Like I would not make it. So and a lot of people are like that, right? Like a lot of people are in a situation like that. So I was shocked when he said that like by evolution, like we should not be living past 35. And that's why, you know, you hear people joking around, like when your mid 30s hit, like you just start feeling awful. Things creak, you know, things ache, you know, you develop arthritis. And another doctor of mine told me that anybody who's older than the age of 18, if they had like bone scans done, there would be some level of arthritis somewhere in their body because we start breaking down, right? Like you're supposed to die at 35, 18 is like middle age, right? Think about it like that. Um, so I was impressed by our medical advancements, but also super bummed out that I've actually already outlived when I should have gone on, because now I feel like, okay, at what point am I going to drop dead now? I made it past 35. So, so sometimes ignorance is bliss, you know. But because of those sort of medical advancements, we do have a lot of people who are living longer, which is fantastic, right? Like you've got Nana around longer, you've got, you know, Nana and Pop and your parents and your aunts and uncles and all the people that you love that you don't want to like lose that soon. They're around longer, right? And that's terrific. However, we are having problems with some of our systems to take care of the elderly that were set in place, like Social Security and Medicare, because we have more people living than we have funding in the system. And we will talk about the why of that in more detail, but a lot of it has to do with cost of living increases and the amount that people put into the system versus inflation and things like that. So we'll be talking about that later on in the book. But so that is a constant dilemma that the government has to take into account. So age distribution, geography, and socioeconomic status can all impact politics as well. So 82% of people live in urban areas, which are issues of concern because things that people are concerned about in urban areas are very different from like rural areas, right? So individuals have moved also from the Northeast and Midwest to the South and Southwest. And as a Floridian, I feel like I have to keep telling people we are full, stop moving here, go away. Like we don't have housing for ourselves. It's hot, we have hurricanes, we have mosquitoes year round. Why do you want to be here? But you know, people keep migrating, and I'm like, go home. Why are you here? So we have geography to take into account as well as to our makeup, like where people are. And believe it or not, like climate like affects things like farming, right? Like farming needs are different like North Dakota than they are in Alabama, right? So those things matter because the constituents of those people who live in those areas have to take that into account whenever they're voting on things. You know, if they've got a lot of sharecroppers, you know, there's like a lot of different factors that go into play, which is why we have representatives for each state and for each area, because our needs are different from place to place, right? Like New Jersey's needs are going to be different from Florida's needs. So geography definitely like has a role. So economics definitely make a difference in a way that people don't like to talk about it, because in addition to politics and religion, people don't want to talk about money, right? Because one, you're going to make somebody feel really, really bad because you have more money than them, or you're going to be the person feeling bad because that person has a lot more money than you, right? So income inequality and economic inequality in general is a very big problem, and it's on the rise, and we're losing the middle class as a result. We're having a much larger gap in recent years between the poor and like the rich, like the haves and the have-nots. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that like cost of living keeps going up, but incomes are not increasing. People are not making more money to account for the fact that rent costs more and gas costs more and healthcare costs more and milk costs more and all of those things. So we're having a very large problem in that respect. So this figure, which is on page 16, shows the income disparities. Okay. So if you look in 1975, it was a much closer gap for like the top 5% of household incomes versus like the lowest fifth of that percentage, right? But as you see, as we moved along between 1975 and 2015, which is what, 85, 95, 40 years, 40 years. Look at this. These people have not moved hardly at all. Like the fourth, third, second, and lowest fifth, where the highest fifth and the top 5% of people have skyrocketed in the amount of money they're making. Those are the people that you work for, right? Like they're the owners of the companies. They're the, you know, the franchisee holders of whatever. Like they're the ones who are making all the money, but you are making the money for them. I mean, get me started on that. So there's a large gap between, you know, the people at the top. We're only at the top because of the work of the people at the bottom. Make no mistake about that. But yet the rest of society is not getting a fair piece of the pie for the amount of work that they're doing, right? So that is a very big problem. And as this disparity has been happening, the cost of things have been going up. So these people are still making the same money. So if they can afford it here, they're not going to be able to afford it here now. So then that puts more people needing government assistance too, right? More people on food stamps, more people on different sorts of aid, where if income disparity wasn't so bad and we adjusted better for inflation in people's incomes, we wouldn't need that much government assistance. So, and we'll talk about that more as we progress in the chapters as well. So these are three pieces of fundamental values that we will talk about ad nauseum in this semester. So in addition to all the things we talked about, you know, active citizenship, political knowledge, political efficacy, there are these three values that are the basis for our system, for our democracy. And they form what's known as our political culture. So political culture are broadly shared values, beliefs, and attitudes about how the government should function. American political culture emphasizes the values of liberty, equality, and democracy. And we will talk about that in a lot of detail as we move on. Those three pillars are what the founding fathers used as their basis when they were forming the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. So those are all very, very important factors in the success and building of our governmental system. And what most people on a broad scale agree with, but the nuances and the breakdowns of how to apply each of those vary greatly in each person. So liberty is limited government, right? That's pretty easy to remember. Also, take heed to all of these sort of definitions that we're talking about. You'll see political knowledge again, and efficacy, and the types of government, and these three, like you will see those again. So you need to be very familiar with the differences in them. Like if you see democracy and republic somewhere, you need to know which is which, right? Because they're similar, but they're not the exact same. It's two parts. So, so something for you to keep in mind, I would make a little note of it, write it down, put it on a sticky note, whatever you need to do. And we'll talk about this again, but with civil liberties and civil rights, civil liberties are freedom from government overreach, government interference. Civil rights are freedom to do certain things, freedom for citizens to have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, the Bill of Rights are the freedoms to do things. Civil liberties are freedom from government overreach. So freedom from civil liberties, freedom to civil rights. You will see that almost verbatim again. So liberty, freedom from government control and economic freedom. So your personal freedom, again, Bill of Rights. Economic freedom, capitalism, free markets, private property, that kind of thing. Economic freedom is linked to concepts of capitalism, specifically laissez-faire capitalism. I'm trying to find where it has specifically laissez-faire. So laissez-faire capitalism is on page 18. It's an economic system where the means of production and distribution are privately owned and operated for profit with minimal or no government interference. So that's part of the free market system, right? It's also the idea that economic freedom is the ability to control your own labor, especially given the country's history with slavery. So that is, like minimum wage is also tied into that. Being able to open your own business is tied to that, those sort of things. So that's important. So it's limited government, right? Government, we are considered to be a limited government. It's a principle of constitutional government, a government whose powers are defined and limited by a constitution. So, like if you were to see a list of like which definitions, match the United States of America, like limited government, constitutional government, democracy, direct democracy, a republic, those things are all definitions that link to describing the United States. So I absolutely love, so when I started teaching at Gulf Coast, we were on, my husband just mentioned it to me the other day because we were actually dating. We started dating like right after I got hired with Gulf Coast. So we were on like the 6th or 7th edition, and we're now on the 13th edition of this book. So so it's changed quite a bit over the years, but I absolutely love some of the new things that they have in the book. So on page 19, it doesn't have a number, but it's right after 18. So it's what you guys are seeing on your screen right here, if you want to follow along. So can young people make a difference in politics? I love these little like extras, like the who participates. And each chapter has like a who participates. And it's really great, like additional information. So it says young people are less likely to participate in politics than older people. Only 46% of young people aged 18 to 29 voted in the 2016 presidential election, which is shameful, compared to 71% of those people over 65. And the 2018 election was historic, with the highest voter turnout for a midterm election in 4 decades, and youth voter turnout broke records in many states. So you can see here, let me zoom this in if you don't have your book with you. So here's the change in voter turnout. So 2014, orange for 18 to 29, and then the blue is 2018. So 15% more, which is great. Total population, we saw had an 11.5% increase. So we had a larger turnout in 2018 than we did in 14, which is good, right? Like more voter turnout is always better. And then here's changes in voter turnout by state. So a couple of states, Louisiana and Kentucky, decreased in voter turnout. Hot mess. And of course it has to be in the South, right? We don't need any extra like nonsense, right? And then like Mississippi and Maine were the smallest increase. And then the lighter oranges, which are several states, Arkansas, West Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Alaska, Nevada, Idaho, and Wyoming, 5 to just under 10%. A ton of tan, which we're part of, Hawaii, Florida, Georgia, Ohio, I can't tell what that is, Maryland, maybe, Connecticut, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, Iowa, South Dakota, North Dakota, Oregon, 10 to 15% increase. I'm impressed with that. That's pretty good, right? Like we're right in the middle of the country, not the best, not the worst. And then the light green, 15 to almost 20% increase. So that's Texas, Arizona, Alabama, DC, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nebraska, Montana, and Washington. And then 20% of like increase in voter turnout. Like these people are my heroes. This is amazing. California, Utah, Kansas, Missouri, Minnesota, Tennessee, Virginia, New Jersey, Vermont, and New Hampshire. So high five to all of them. So Missouri was the largest increase at 28% more voters than they had in the previous midterm, which was in 2014. So, and I explain what midterms are in detail in the discussion board project video, and we'll also talk about it more when it comes to that point in the chapter. But for those of you who are like, what's a midterm? Watch the second video. So so this is just like awesome to me. Like that's fantastic that we had so much increase in voter turnout. So like I'm very pleased with that. So a couple of different reasons why the turnout is so vastly different between people under the age of 30 and people over the age of 65. So people who are over the age of 65 on average are more likely to be retired. So they have more free time in their day, right? They've got more time to do the research. They have more time to learn about the issues, go to council meetings, talk to their mayor on the regular basis, make sure that they know that like, Mrs. Smith is not happy with the pothole on her street or whatever, right? So they've got the time to devote to be engaged in the process. And they've got the time to go and stand in line on election day and get their I voted stickers and wait to vote. The younger the person is, the less free time they have. So so that's an issue for a lot of people who work full time, have families, maybe work 2 jobs. Maybe they're going back to school on top of all of that, and they're worried about their mortgage and whatever. And so it's harder for them to do it. So they're more likely to vote early because they've got several days to, work it into their schedule, or maybe they'll get like a vote by mail ballot. So it's sitting at the house, eyeballing them on the coffee table until they finally get around to filling it out. Hopefully that wasn't incredibly loud. If it was, I apologize. And as you go back to younger people, under 30 are more likely to be in college, just starting out, just moving up maybe a little bit in their jobs. They're having to bust their tail to get established. Maybe they're just now trying to get their first home, or maybe they've got an apartment, maybe they've got a couple of jobs to try and make ends meet. Maybe they're young parents, and it's difficult for them to have the free time and the bandwidth, the mental bandwidth, to do what needs to be done to be an engaged voter. And so they're less likely to turn out. And because of that, they're less likely to be pursued by candidates. And their issues are not listened to as much because people know that they don't vote. So that's why the first thing to get raised is like, say, the cost of college tuition or the student loan interest rates, because they know you're not out there having your voice heard. But they'll be darned if they're going to touch Medicare and Social Security, because those people are who put them into office. So if you are in that category, and most of you are, and you don't like the idea of that, and you don't want your rent to be price gouged, because the older you are, the more likely you are to own a home, not rent, right? Vote, show up and vote. Call your elected officials and complain. Do not sit on your laurels and let them screw over your life because you're not showing up, right? Decisions are made by the people in the room, so be in the room. Like, that's really what it boils down to. So that's why less people show up, and then that's why, and then it's a cycle, right? Well, why would I show up? They don't listen to me anyways. Well, they don't listen to you because you don't show up, right? And a lot of elected officials and candidates are trying to shift that focus and target younger people to get them out, because it's sort of an untapped resource. But it depends on the candidate. Like, not everybody's going to come after you for your vote. Like, they're going to go to the low hanging fruit, right? So but that's why a lot of campaigns and political parties are starting to push early voting and vote by mail. Like, fine, you can't get to the polls, that's cool. Like, we have other options for you. So and don't think that you can't do that. Like, used to, there were a lot of restrictions on who could get a vote by mail ballot, and now there are none. Anybody can get one. So if your schedule's crazy and you need to be able to fill out your ballot at 2 o'clock in the morning and stick it in the mailbox before you leave the next morning, do that, right? Like, there's no excuse. You never have to step into, you never have to step in the elections office. You can do the registration like remotely through the mail. You can get a vote by mail ballot. Like, you never have to even know where the supervisor of elections office is, except for to mail your ballot in and to mail your voter registration form. And it's right there. Like, the return address is on the absentee ballot, the return address is on the voter registration form. So there's literally no excuse not to be involved, because you never have to go out of your house to participate in democracy. So okay, we already did that. All right, so so now, are we in the last? I think we're at the last goal, the last chapter goal. Let me look. Let me double check. We are, right? Yes. So we're in the last section, which is summarize Americans' attitudes towards government. Woohoo! We're almost done with chapter 1. What? I have no idea what time it is. I hope I haven't been like rambling way longer than. No, I think we're good. I try to keep each of these lectures to like the time it would be like if you were physically in a class, right? Like, I'm not trying to make like 4-hour videos. Because I could talk about these subjects all day, but I try to keep them like in the length of a regular class period or less. So hopefully I'm able to do that for you guys. So the next section talks about equality, right? So we talked about liberty, and then it's equality and democracy. So did it skip over? No. Okay. All right, we're good. So the Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal, because they didn't think about women as equals at the time, but now it's like the proverbial man, like humankind, right, are supposed to be all created equal. So principles of equality include the following: equality of opportunity. Now, this one throws a lot of people off. It's the idea that all people should have the freedom to use their talents and wealth to reach their fullest potential. Which sounds really great on paper, but because we don't live in a society where equality is really equal, like where people really have the same, people don't have the same opportunities, right? Like, we don't all start out on equal footing. Like, if you're born into a family with money, you're ahead of the game, right? If you're white, you're ahead of the game. If you're, like, there's so many things that you have no control over that put you at different positions of the race we call life. I actually have a video that I'll post later about that when we're talking about it in more detail. So So it's the opportunity for equality, but the opportunities are not equal for everybody. So it's sort of a catch-22. But that's the principle. That's our goal. That's what our goal is to get to, right? And then political equality, which is the right for all people to participate in politics equally based on one person, one vote, right? Everybody has an equal say is the thought process behind political equality, which they talk about on page 20, if you're following along in your book. So equality implies the obligation for the government to its people, and to the degree in which government should promote equality, in particular social and economic equality. It's a very controversial subject. It shouldn't be, but it is, because a lot of people feel like the government shouldn't give you anything. You hear people talk about like, I shouldn't get a handout. It's not necessarily a handout, but a hand up for people who aren't on the same starting point. And we'll talk about that in more detail as the semester goes on. So this picture says the fight for $15. It's a nationwide effort to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. First gained traction in 2013, increasing public awareness of income inequality in the United States. By 2020, many states had increased their minimum wage above the federal minimum wage, but few had reached the $15 threshold that workers had protested for. And as you guys know, that has recently been passed federally, and they all have till whatever year, I can't remember what it is. I think it's 2026 or something, to get up to that 15. The downside to that is that is still not actually enough to match our inflation and economic issues, but it's to close the gap a little bit. So again, we'll talk about that in a lot more detail, because money sets you in a different class. We can say we don't have classes of people here, but we absolutely do. And so it definitely makes a big difference, to, are you scrounging for food by the end of the week, or or whatnot? Do you have to pay one bill late so you can pay another bill on time and not have your lights cut off or whatever? So I mean, there are a lot of people who really are in those sort of dire straits because they're making minimum wage still. And there's not one person in the United States who makes the current federal minimum wage who can afford a one-bedroom apartment by themselves. Nobody. If you make the minimum wage and you're living in a one-bedroom apartment by yourself, you're either in somebody's backyard and it's not really a legit apartment with standard rent, or you're robbing Peter to pay Paul and you are not paying all of your bills. Because of how much the cost of living is now. So that is part of why there has been this push for a national, like, federal minimum wage raise, basically, because it hasn't been risen in a substantial way to match up with our current cost of living. And we're one of the only industrialized nations that do not increase people's pay to match the cost of living. Like, other countries do that. Instead of a minimum wage, they have a cost of living wage. Like, okay, if it costs this much to live, then everybody's making at least that, right? And we don't do that here. But in all other industrialized nations, Europe, Australia, whatever, Canada, they do have those sort of systems in place. So and then the third value, democracy. Obviously, democracy, very important American value. It's right there, like in our, we talk about democracy and, and our democratic, values and that kind of thing. Like, we hear democracy a lot. So democracy is the idea that we choose the people who are in charge, and we have a certain level of say over what they do, and that if they don't listen to the needs of the people, they'll be replaced with somebody who does. So that is part of our democracy. Now, that being said, there are caveats, right? So think about during the civil rights movement, you know, the majority of people who were voting, who were engaged, who were active, were white folks, and a lot of those people were racist. Not all of them, right? Of course, but a lot of them. And so they didn't want integration. They didn't want Black people to have the same rights as them because they wanted to be superior to them. So that would be the majority of people who were voting, right? So in theory, that's what should have still been listened to. And it was by the government elected officials, but the Supreme Court is not elected. And I won't go into this into a lot of detail until we get further along in the book, but that's part of the reason why the Supreme Court is not elected, is because they can follow the law and say, this is not constitutional. And I don't really care if you don't like it, it's not constitutional. And I'm just here to do my job. Like, you can't fire me because I'm not doing what you think I should be doing. So there's less politics in theory, involved in the Supreme Court. That's the idea behind not having them elected. That's not always the case. And we'll talk about that more in the Supreme Court chapter, or in the federal courts chapter, rather. It's not specifically Supreme Court, but largely Supreme Court. So when ultimate political authority rests with the citizens, as it does in our democracy, it's called popular sovereignty. You'll see that again. So popular sovereignty, principle of democracy where political authority rests in the hands of the people. So make sure to make a note of that. So the power for our democracy rests on the principle of, and this sounds weird, but the majority of people rule, but the minority of people still have rights. So the government follows the preferences of the majority of voters, like I was just talking about, but still protects the interests of the minority. So even if you're not the majority of people, the principle of democracy is that you don't get screwed over by the majority of people because you have a different viewpoint, or because you're a woman, or because you're a minority, or whatever, right? So, and we'll talk about ways in which there's that checks and balances as we talk more. So we, like I said before, we as a society are not keen on trusting the government. So therefore, we've been really afraid to give a lot of power to the government. So, and we will talk about this in a ton of detail in a future chapter, but as a quick little thing that it's talking about, in 1933, with the Great Depression, you guys are pretty familiar, I would hope, with the Great Depression. A lot of stuff went wrong with the economy. A large percentage of people were homeless. A large percentage of people were unemployed. And we were about to be in a world of trouble if we didn't do something. And the issue was so big that individual states couldn't handle it. And that was when we first started to see the federal government grow, because it was an issue big enough that somebody larger than the states had to handle it, which would be the federal government. So they started to expand what they handled to pull us out of the Great Depression. So as a result, today the national government oversees a lot that it wasn't originally intended to. But the founding fathers also couldn't have foreseen the Great Depression happening. So so now our government oversees our economy. It's the largest employer in government contracts and the military and stuff like that. It controls the military, and it regulates our social and commercial activities. And of course, we'll go into all of those details. Like I mentioned before, public trust has absolutely declined. 3/4 of Americans trusted government most of the time in the 60s. And in 2020, only 17% of people said that they felt the same, which is just sad, right? I think that's very sad. I want to skip over these real quick, and I'm going to come back to them. I want to go to something that's further back here. I think it's back here. Yes. Okay, so I love, again, like I said before, I love the inserts. So there's always a who participates section in your book for each chapter. And then there's always a how to. So this is on page 22 and 23, if you can see that there. So it talks about ways to debate respectfully. This is a massive problem, especially in the day and age of social media, right? People are not respectful to each other. We a rude group of people, okay? Because we're used to hiding behind computer screens and, being a keyboard warrior and not worrying about the fact that there's another person on the other end of that we're being just a hateful, not nice word to, you know? So this talks about ways to have disagreements, political or otherwise, but in a professional, respectful manner. So government by the people functions best when people discuss ideas, share their preferences, and talk about what government's doing. But discussion and debate can be uncomfortable, especially with people who disagree, or when politics is very polarizing. To learn how to engage others in debate respectfully, we spoke to April Lawson, the director of debates for Better Angels, a national organization that works with individuals from across the political spectrum to combat polarization and restore civil dialogue across America. She offers these tips for successful and civil political conversations. So the most important thing is good faith. If somebody says something you can't stand, know that they're trying and they want to address the hard questions. Assume that the other person is smart and that they are moral. As soon as we start talking down to each other, like, we in trouble. And I have been guilty of this. We've all been guilty of this. Like, man, this person's an idiot, and you're off on the wrong foot, right? So don't do that. Number two, say what you actually believe. Don't hem-haw around about it. Like, you can state your truth without being like, no, you're an idiot because you don't agree with me. So it says genuineness and sincerity are crucial. You could debate either by making a case no one could disagree with, or by sharing what you really feel about the issue. The latter will make a much more productive exchange of ideas. So again, speaking your truth. Yes, you could just argue a case where people are like, oh, I don't really have an argument for that. And there's nothing wrong with that as well, but it's helpful if you speak from the heart a little bit too, right? So number three, how can you launch such a discussion or such a conversation, set the tone? A good technique is to start with a question of genuine curiosity for the other person, which reassures them that you want to know what they believe, even if you don't really, right? Like, you know what I'm talking about. Like, there are times where you're like, I don't really care what you have to say because, like, my line is drawn in the sand and this is like, I'm right and anybody who doesn't agree with me is wrong. But it's better to, like, because if you're not going to listen to them, they're not going to listen to you. Like, what if, okay, even if you are right, you're not going to be able to get your thoughts out there to perhaps persuade them or to make them see another angle if you're not respectful, you know? So another tip is to paraphrase what they've said before you respond. Like, oh, so like you feel blah, 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 to make sure the other person feels heard. When you respond, it helps to express some doubt or nuance in your own argument. So this is really about being logical enough to not be so bullheaded that you can't see the other side of the argument. It's really helpful to see both sides, and because one, it helps you make your point clearer if you understand the other side. It also shows that you are not so stubborn that you can't understand other people's viewpoints. And you don't want to box yourself off to the point where you can't understand where other people are coming from, because that's just not how society works. And you're not going to be dealing with people your entire life who agree exactly like you do. That's just not how the world works. You don't need to agree with everything they said, but you can pick something reasonable the other person said and say, you said X, which makes sense because of Y. Number five, know that you may need to be the bigger person in the conversation. In order to be an ambassador of civility, you may need the patience to ask several genuine questions of curiosity before the other person believes that you, where is it? Why is it not doing right? Oh, because it's on another page. Sorry. um, uh, believes that you're actually interested in what they have to say, and you need to control your own emotions and triggers to manage your activation, since you know these rules for civil engagement and they may not. Number 6, finally realize that you have agency. Prepare yourself for these tough conversations by telling yourself, I will probably have feelings about this, right? Like I might be upset, right? But I can be patient and manage them. Remember, you're not trapped. You can take a break. You can change topics. You may want to have a conversational exit in mind. If it's Thanksgiving and you're speaking with your crazy uncle, you might pivot to the football game. Debating respectfully requires coming to the table with a posture of openness and helping the other person feel heard. In America, at the talking point level, which is a surface level, we don't agree at all. But if you go down even one level to political values, or even one more level to moral values, then there's a lot of common ground. With these conversations, we're not trying to change how you see the issue. We're trying to change how you see the other person, which is important because we have absolutely lost our civility. And we see it with our politicians, right? Like name calling and just down and dirty, like just children on a playground pulling each other's hair. It's ridiculous. We're all grown-ups and it's time we get back to acting like them. So this picture says April Lawson is conducting trainings to encourage more respectful political dialogue. So, and then there's another picture, go back. This says, while levels of participation in politics are relatively low for young Americans, presidential primary campaigns often draw many young people to volunteer and vote. And a question that the book asks you to kind of ask of yourself is, what factors might energize young people to become involved in campaigns? So, and that's important for campaigns to understand, because, okay, great, like you're going towards that 65-year-old. Well, that's great until grandma's not around anymore. You know who are going to be around? Those young kids that you ignored. And maybe by the time they're 65, they'll have forgotten about that, but maybe they won't. And they're the next generation of leadership and people who are going to be making the decisions. So you may as well listen to them a little bit now, right? So so there you go. So before I start the public opinion section, on page 24 and 25, I always love the citizen and government, what do you think? Like this is a kind of a question wrap up, if you will, of the chapter, and they have that at the end of every chapter. So it says, given what you've learned in this chapter about American political culture, take a closer look at the account of the coronavirus on page 2 to 4 and consider the following questions. Given your political values, your beliefs on liberty, equality, and democracy, what do you think of government efforts to address the coronavirus pandemic? If you were to contact an elected official about these efforts, which American values would you emphasize? The liberty, equality, or democracy? In what ways does the diversity of the American people represent a strength for American democracy? In what ways is it a challenge for democracy? And how important do you think participation, knowledge, and efficacy are for functioning of American democracy? What would make you more engaged in government? Are you friends, family, or fellow students engaged in politics? How do you imagine Kimberly Green Yates would answer these questions? So, which Kimberly is somebody that they talk about in the book earlier on. And right here, we introduced Kimberly Green Yates, who is struggling to get protective medical equipment for nursing homes she runs in Oklahoma. So that's talked about at the very beginning of the book. So these are good questions to basically apply what you've learned in the chapter to like real world situations. So it's a really great connection for it to make sense, because like I mentioned in the course introduction lecture, that's my degree is on applied political science. Like, how does it work in the real world? And I find with any subject, if you can apply it to a real world application, it sticks with you better, you understand it better, and you hold the information better. So these questions really help with that. So do these public opinion polls. So obviously we're not in a live class, so I can't actually ask you these, but I will kind of summarize over them real quick. So the first one is, how much would you say the work and decisions of the federal government affect what happens in your life? Not at all, a little, a moderate amount, a lot, or a great deal. I would hope that after we went over that day in the life of a university student, you would answer E, a great deal, because you can see how the government really touches so many aspects of your day that you're not even consciously aware of. Poll opinion number 2. Do you believe our government should do more, the same, or less for the citizens of our country? Now, that is completely subjective and based on your personal political values. Large government, small government, depends on the situation, whatever. And some of you might not know that yet, right? Like some of you might not have an idea of what sort of government you're interested in because you don't really know a lot about it. And that's perfectly fine. That's what you're here for. Number 3, how much of the time do you think you can trust the federal government to do what is right and fair? Again, that's where you personally are in your belief in political efficacy to actually make a difference, and your public trust that they're actually going to do it. So this is completely subjective. For myself, it all depends on who's in office. Like, the people who match my political values more, I'm going to say most of the time. When they don't, some of the time or never, right? And again, this is a very subjective question. How much do you believe public officials care what people like you think? As we just went over, a lot of that depends on your demographics, right? It depends on your age. It depends on how active of a voter you are. And really, the way for you to be heard is to show up, to be engaged and let your voice be heard, because then you show up on an active voter list when they're pulling records and they're finding out who's actually voting. Who do I need to pay attention to? Who do I need to pander to? Who do I need to reach out to with my mail pieces, with my phone banks, with my door-to-door, like, please vote for me? That only happens if you're already showing up at the polls and making your voice heard. Otherwise, they're not going to know you exist. So a lot of this has to do with what you put out to them. If you say you need to pay attention to me because I show up and vote all the time, they're going to see that based on your records. Now, they don't know how you voted because that's private, but they can see that you voted when they get the records from the elections office. So a lot of this depends on you. So a public opinion poll number 5, how much do you believe people like you can affect what the government does? Again, subjective based on your political efficacy. Public opinion poll number 6, how interested are you in information about what is going on in government politics? And I see people answer all over the spectrum about this. I would hope that if not now, by the end of the class, you would answer very or extremely interested. I know a lot of people are not interested at all, especially when you don't know what they're always talking about. It makes it harder to be engaged, right? Because you feel lost. That's like putting me in a math class. You start talking about formulas and stuff, and I'm like, huh, what, who? You're speaking another language, right? So hopefully by the end of this class, you'll feel more confident in your information about government politics, and it'll make you more interested, or at least more informative if you watch the news and like you know what's going on. So public opinion poll number 7, how often do you pay attention to what's going on in government politics? Hopefully that will be most of the time or all the time by the time we're done. So, and then we've gone through all of this information. So let me exit out of this. And so I ended that. So one of the things that's really helpful for you to do at the end of each of the chapters, in addition to like reviewing, you know, the definitions and the what do you think questions that are like at the end, there's a study guide at the end of each chapter, and it's got different questions from the chapter and key terms. This is awesome. Like pages 25 to 27 ask basically summary questions. This is a great study tool for you before you take your quiz on the chapter and when you're putting together stuff to study for the exam. I can promise you some of these exact questions you will see on the quiz, some of the exact questions you'll see on the exam. Not all of them. Some will be different. Some of them might even be worded a little differently, but the concepts, you will absolutely see a lot of these same concepts again. So it's really important for you to take the time to review this information. So hopefully between this lecture and your reading and the study guides that I'll provide, it'll give you everything you need to be able to do well. So I highly recommend after you watch this video, and because we went over this in such detail, for those of you who are not strong readers, the lectures will be very helpful, right? Like for people who are like, man, like I'm not going to retain all of this, but auditorily, you know, like hearing the lecture might help a lot with that. So I would definitely recommend going back and doing the study guide and like kind of quizzing yourself to say, hey, do I remember the definition of that particular key term or whatever. It will be immensely helpful to you. So hopefully this has been informative to you. As soon as it finishes processing, I'll get it posted up tonight, and get chapters 2 and 3 up ASAP as well. So, but since you guys are just starting out, like most of you are not gonna, or you're not ready for chapters 2 and 3, so it's okay. And again, you've got like all week, right? Like stuff is not due until Sunday. You've got time. You can go ahead and do the reading if you need to, right? Like you don't have to wait for the lecture first. Like you can go back and do that as a review. So because I basically have to wait until, because my husband works from home. So I have to wait until he gets off work in the evenings. He works 10-hour days, Monday through Thursday. So I have to wait until he gets off work at like 6, 7 o'clock at night for him to take over baby duty with our toddler, for me to lock myself in our room to be able to do these recordings. And so that becomes tricky because she gets upset if she can't get to me after a while. And then I, like right now, I can hear her. She just woke up, unfortunately, like in the middle of the night. So she's not happy. And that's probably because she came to the door and heard me but couldn't get to me. So I have to like wait until he's off work to like run interference. So because I don't have anybody to watch her, like I don't have anywhere else to like record without like some kind of interruption. So anyway, so this is now done for you guys for chapter 1. So if you have any questions, if something doesn't make sense, if you like you've read it, you've listened to me, you've done the thing, you've done the study guide, and you're like, this concept makes absolutely no sense, please feel free to email me. If you need me to go over it verbally with you, like I mentioned before, we can absolutely set up a Zoom meeting for me to talk to you in more detail. If you just need me to, you know, maybe answer a quick question or explain it in a different wording in an email, I can do that too. So the class is definitely what you make it. Do not stay quiet. If there's something that doesn't make sense, please let me know, because I can't help you when it's like an hour before the exam because I might not see your email, right? So I need you to make sure that you're paying attention. I will also put this in an email to everybody tomorrow. I'll send out this link, because I know not everybody might like think to check to see if it's up. And I'll make sure to make a note, but please check the module section on the Respondus system in Canvas, because all of you will need to have that set up to do your exams, because it's not open book, open note, and you need to have that on so it can see that you're doing it the way you need to do it. So please make sure to take time to look over that. I have an instructional video on how to do Respondus. So, and then if you have any questions, something doesn't make sense, then I can get answers from the college, or you can contact tech support and we can get it worked out. Don't wait until next Wednesday, which is the last day to take the first exam. You know, it'll be open next Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, and then you've got like an hour to do it once you log in. Don't wait until like Wednesday at 11 o'clock at night to start trying to take it, and then you have not done anything with Respondus and you have no idea how to set up, because then it's too late. So make sure that you look at it beforehand, so that way if you need help, there's time to get it. So, okay, so that was chapter 1. So hopefully not too painful. Hopefully like it all made sense, and definitely let me know if you have any questions. So I will be talking with you again soon. Have a good day. Bye guys.